Welcome back to the studio. I'm Sarah and I've been a milliner and educator for over 30 years and I hate dragging out the sewing machine. So in this video, I'm going to show you how you can get this beautiful bound finish using Petersham or with hand stitching. 2 stitches you're going to learn, and there'll also be a little extra bonus stitch for when you're joining your felt crown to your felt brim. When I start sewing my hats, the first thing I do is make sure I'm choosing a good quality thread. I want a thread that is smooth, not too fluffy, quite fine, with quite a bit of strength to it. So I think buying good thread is worth the investment. Once I've chosen my thread for a job, regardless of whether I'm sewing a felt, a straw, a foundation fabric, or sewing with single or double thread, the very first thing I do is wax it. I run it through my clean wax a few times just to make sure it's really nicely coated. And then to make sure I'm not getting too much wax on my hat and it's not creating too much kind of residue there, I'm just going to run it through my hot iron, and this makes sure that the wax is really nicely in the thread and that my thread is smooth. This is a stitch I use when I want to hold my wire close to the edge of my hat, so close to this raw cut edge of the felt. I've shaped my wire so that it kind of echoes the curve of the edge of my brim, and I'm going to place it right on there and stitch it so it can't move around. This is a great stitch for when I want to put a wire on my hat that is there for a bit more stability, but is also going to help me shape the hat. So I need my wire not to move around, change its position, or it's going to change the shape of my hat. First thing I'm doing is kind of going through that same hole twice with a stitch that is straight up and down so that it's firmly clasping the wire onto the edge. Then I'm going to move across a little bit, so creating almost a zigzag stitch. Bringing it across so that I've got that little zigzag, and then I just follow that pattern for the rest of the brim. Using the same hole to pull through there. Tightening it, but not so much that I'm letting this roll over the edge there. So I'm going to keep it sitting perfectly on that edge, and then just continuing to create my zigzag stitch. When I'm doing this stitch, I like to keep it fairly small because the job of this stitch is to hold this wire perfectly in place. If I get too wide here, it just gives the wire a little bit too much room to move around. And if I get too wide this way, I run the risk of my bind not covering it or giving myself too much room for the wire to slip over the edge and fall into those little V's. So I just keep going this way, all the way around the brim of my hat. You can see now that I've finished this edge that I have a really sturdy, solid bit of wire that won't roll off the edge, causing a little bump either on the bottom or the top of a hat, which I'd be able to see in my bind. And it also still allows me a little bit of movement. So I feel if I want to scooch my hat up a little bit, create a little bit of a curve in there, I can still do that, or I can smooth it out. And if I decide to curl my hat up a little bit anyway, use that wire to create some structure, it's still going to stay neatly sitting right along the edge there. So perfect stitch for keeping that wire in place and making sure your edge is still smooth and not going to give us any texture in whatever bind we do on this edge. You can bind a felt with a lot of different things, but for me, Petersham is the classic and I think it always looks amazing. There's something about the texture of the rib of the Petersham against the felt that I think is just beautiful. So I've grabbed my Petersham ribbon here. You can grab any kind of width that you like. Just make sure it's enough to go over the edge of the felt. I've folded it in half and already given it a little bit of a curve so it will sit snugly around my hat. The very first thing I do is I want to pop it around the edge of my hat, making sure that my wire is right against the Petersham here so that it can't move around and so I don't have any excess fabric kind of flapping around out here that can get a little bit battered around and look a little bit shabby. I'm then going to grab a single waxed thread. So you just want a single one for this one, and generally I would use something that matched my bind perfectly, but for this I'm going to use a darker thread so that you can see what I'm doing. The first step is to start on the inside of your bind, either side, front or back, doesn't really matter, and come up through right on the edge of one of these Petersham pieces. So one of the little bumps in the Petersham. Pull your thread through, and then I can tuck my knot securely under there and out of the way so that it can't be seen on either side of the hat. What I'm trying to do with this stitch is make sure it's as invisible as possible so that it looks like somehow that bind is just sitting there perfectly. So I am going to just jump over one rib in my Petersham over to the next spot where I don't have a little bump. I'm then going to come through to the other side, right on the edge. It can be a little bit hard to get started, through a bump. So I've sewn directly through the felt there. So straight front to back or back to front, depending what you're doing. And I've ended up with one little stitch here, which you can imagine was, if it was in this beautiful cream color, you would hardly be able to see it at all. Once I'm over this side, I'm again going to jump over one little rib there, but instead of sewing straight through the hat, I'm going to come through at a bit of an angle so that I move across, maybe about 2 or 3 ribs, and I end up over here. This takes a little bit of practice to get your groove, and kind of every time I start it, it just takes me a moment to get into the rhythm of it. So you can see I'm coming through just a little bit further along than the first stitch that I did, pulling my thread through, and now I have a tiny stitch on the front and on the back of there. Again, I'm just going to pop over one stitch going straight through my hat. So I'm ending up a little bit further along than my stitch over here as well. And once you get into the rhythm of it, you'll find that your stitches end up perfectly aligned just because you get used to how far and at what angle you need to push through to get them all aligned. I swapped over to sewing this with a thread that was much closer in colour to the actual bind of this hat. And you can see that when I did that, the stitches became virtually invisible. So while I've still got these little stitches on both sides, you can't really see them when they're in the right colour. All I need to do when I'm done is smooth that out a little bit with my fingers, and I have the perfectly bound edge that still shows the hand of the maker, giving it a beautiful handmade feel, just elevating it a little bit more than just a machine stitch. While this hat is in one piece, what happens if you want to join your crown and your brim of a felt hat together, make it look seamless so you can choose whether to trim it or leave it really plain? This is a stitch I use when I'm joining my two pieces and I want it to look completely seamless. So for this stitch, let's pretend this is my brim with my collar area here, and this is my crown. I'm going to make sure that my crown slips over that collar and neatly tucks right into that collar line. So they're sitting perfectly together, and the brim would be flush against the brim there. So kind of seamless. And the very first thing I want to do with a single wax thread is just hide my knot up in here on my collar line. So I'm going to come in from the front of my brim, bring my thread to the back, tuck my little knot in there, and then come through to the front. My very first stitch is going to be into my crown, maybe less than half a centimeter up from the edge, coming through, binding those two pieces together. And my next stitch, I'm not going to catch my crown again, but I'm going to come straight into the collar line of my brim. And this is going to leave me with one small little stitch that's sitting right on the edge of where my crown fits into my brim. And I'm just going to continue to do that along the hat. So a longer stitch in here, and then straight through to the front where I'm catching a small part of my crown, and then coming through back into my brim, into my collar line. And this is going to give me, once I finished it, a really seamless finish to my hat. Once I pull those stitches through, all I need to do is rough up my felt a little bit and then give it a brush, and you're barely going to be able to see those pin stitches that I put in there, particularly if you do them in the exact same color as your felt. So you can see now, right in my collar line, I've got a really strong but almost invisible join right at the stress point of my hat where we pull it onto our head. So it's going to stay secure, but give us the options of having trims or no trims. So that's how we get the edge of a brim looking perfect with Petersham. If there's other tips and tricks you'd love to know, drop a comment below. And if you found this video helpful, make sure you like it, and of course subscribe to watch our other videos on how to master millinery.